So just to start, the 234 billion number, that's an estimate from the Yunus administration, and we weren't able to independently verify such a large number. But when I was working for The Economist covering Bangladesh, this is back in from 2017 onwards, there were always rumors around money being taken out of the country and how this was done, via hundi or over and under invoicing. I became particularly interested in it when I started to look at the banks. So I did a few articles looking at the banking sector, one on particular on Islami Bank. And it seemed to be what was happening was that the banks were being taken over, and then they were issuing loans to friends or associates of the Awami League government. And those loans, though, were never going to be paid back. They were never intended to be paid back. And that's why you saw the rate of non-performing loans really rapidly increase. And so that was, a good few years ago, 2018, 2019, that those numbers started to tick up. And where is that money going? Is it staying in Bangladesh, or is it being taken outside? And when you look into some of the big conglomerates and the families behind them, the evidence and the circumstances pointed to the suggestion or, the allegation that money was being taken out. And even if you looked on their social media accounts, it did seem like there was a lot of money that was winding up in places like the UK, the US, Canada, Dubai. Sure. I mean, we weren't able to trace the money being taken out of Bangladesh to the UK, but we did look at the properties, for example, of various associates of the government or various Bangladeshis who were prominent, including Saifuzman Chowdhury. Now, he had over 300 properties in the UK, and some of those were quite mundane in their size. They weren't extraordinarily expensive, but some of them we're talking about millions. And so if you think that's just one person with 300 properties in a very expensive property market like London, you can see how it easily adds up to millions and billions. For me, it was a person of interest from before. Again, it was one of those areas where I'd heard rumors, had various tips, but nothing substantial. After the fall of Sheikh Hasina, that we started to properly look into that property empire that he'd amassed, all the holding companies, because it's quite complex. Not all of them, were directly in his name. Some of those properties were under holding companies. So we started to sort of compile a spreadsheet, if you will, detailing the extent of this property empire that he'd amassed in the UK. Mostly residential properties. Not all of them were in London. Some of them were outside, but a lot of them are in London. And some of them are in quite sort of average areas of London, but some of them are in quite fancy parts of the city. And as I said, worth millions of pounds. So yeah, it's quite remarkable for someone who was the land minister of, a developing or less economically developed country to have had the resources to buy all these properties. In the UK, the National Crime Agency, the NCA, has frozen those properties. And so those, are going to be investigated. He cannot sell them. And so pending that investigation, so far this is an investigation, these are allegations. But if it's proven that money is laundered and is illegitimate, then, those properties could be taken off him. And ultimately, there is a possibility that this forms part of the asset recovery for Bangladesh and that money is returned to the Bangladeshi state. I mean, it's a very good question. So when we spoke to various watchdogs or NGOs that act as watchdogs on this, they said that the UK is a real prime hotspot for this kind of money laundering and this kind of corruption, and where money often ends up. And although the government has said they're going to do more to keep an eye on this and to stop it before it happens, clearly enough is not being done, because or more needs to be done, because yes, he was able to amass such a large property portfolio, and it was only after the fall of Sheikh Hasina, when some of these individuals started to be investigated more closely, that this came to light and action has been taken. So clearly something was missed earlier, or the question is I think it's legitimate to ask the question, could this have been caught earlier? Could something have been stopped earlier? Could this have been stopped earlier, and could it have been prevented? So there's several properties that aroused interest connected to Tulip Siddiq, one of which she had been gifted when she was in her early 20s. Now, she claimed it was gifted to her by her parents, but actually it was given to her by a man named Abdul Muttalif, who has connections to or had connections to the Awami League government under Sheikh Hasina. Something we investigated, and the series of properties related to this, ultimately, Tulip Siddiq has denied any wrongdoing, and she was not fired from the government. She resigned because she was city minister, which also means within her brief it included anti-corruption. So you had someone who oversees anti-corruption in the city, the financial centre of the UK, involved in these allegations of corruption, and who hasn't disclosed that she's been gifted this property by a man with connections to her aunt's regime in Bangladesh. So it all looked very fishy, shall we say, but yes, she denies all wrongdoing. Well, now she's back to being, a backbench MP. Backbench MPs don't tend to have much news time. They're not particularly famous. I mean, but she does still, there is the ongoing investigation in Bangladesh, which creates news stories, raises her profile with the British public, not necessarily in a good way. And as I said, she's also part of the series of appointments that have led to a broader questioning of the Prime Minister Keir Starmer's judgment and his ability to make the correct judgment when it comes to appointing people. Some have said, how did they appoint her as someone with a brief for anti-corruption as a minister without looking into the complexities of her close ties to the regime in Bangladesh and everything that goes with that? Because even if, as I said, she's completely denied any wrongdoing, as has all of her family, but it warranted, further investigation. Some have said, allegedly, that this should have been looked into because of the risk that something came out later, as it did, and the reputational damage for this government. So I would say that on that level, she's on the radar of the British public. I don't know that she is under investigation in anything criminal in the UK. Obviously, she is in Bangladesh, because in the UK, it's not a problem that she was gifted these properties. It's more the transparency around which she came to own these properties, and her position as minister and potentially as MP, which created the problems for her and made this, her continuing as a minister with anti-corruption as part of her brief untenable. But there's no criminal allegations against her in the UK. That's only in Bangladesh. I think, broadly speaking, the fact that she was appointed anti-corruption minister has raised questions about Keir Starmer's, the Prime Minister's, judgment and his the ability of his team to do due diligence on the people that they appoint to such positions. It's a very, very complicated process involving lots of lawyers and complexity. But one thing I will say is that, I've heard this discussed in a Bangladeshi context, and a lot of people are very pessimistic about the idea that any money will ever be recovered, because who knows what's going to happen in the next election, and whoever is elected, will they continue with this? But I will say that, if the process is started in a country such as the UK by the freezing of properties or other assets by the National Crime Agency, then even if the government in Bangladesh changes, and even if the next government has no interest in asset recovery, that process here still continues. So that's why it's so important over the next few months that remain, is to get country where money was taken to or siphoned off to get them on board with asset recovery and with looking into this, because once that that process is set in motion, then it will continue. And that's separate from whatever happens in Bangladesh. But yes, it's very legally complicated. There's a lot, the burden of proof is very, very high. And also the other thing about asset recovery is when we look at other countries that have done this, often it's about a settlement. So, that means going to some of those accused of siphoning off cash from Bangladesh and saying, okay, we will drop criminal charges or we will whatever if you give X amount back. Now, that might not be very palatable to Bangladeshis who want to see accountability. They want to see these tycoons who got rich and taken out of their country. They want to see them held to account. But sometimes that is a more feasible way of getting, this is personal. I personally think there is no way you're getting all the money back. But something is better than nothing, I guess, is how I would see it. Well, the Anti-Corruption Commission has named 11 groups or individuals or families that are worthy of interest to them. And I would just say that, there are a lot of people within those circles who have strong ties to the UK and who given the UK's prominence as a hotspot for laundered money and the particular ties between Bangladesh and the UK, given the large British Bangladeshi community we have here, and the strength of the Hundi network, for example, I would say we are definitely investigating, the possibility that there is more to be revealed about money laundered to the UK, and a lot of this is just at this point rumor or conjecture, but there's some, so it sort of ranges on a spectrum from hypotheses that are plausible through to those named by the Anti-Corruption Commission in Bangladesh because they have evidence, all the way through to those under investigation by the National Crime Agency in the UK. And there's a strong level of collaboration between the two countries, and so I'm sure that at that level investigations are underway. And back at the other end of the spectrum, we hear, for example, that money might have ended up in the UK via artworks that were moved and, money put into art. So there's all sorts of ways in which this could have happened that we haven't yet been able to trace. And as you know, tracing money moved through Hundi is really, really hard. So we have to look for other ways to see how this money ended up here and whether it came here legitimately or illegitimately. Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think there's just a lot more to come on the links between, the UK and Bangladesh, and particularly under the Awami League. I think there's a lot more to come out there. And also, the Anti-Corruption Commission has got a long list of people in cases, and these are yet to work their way through the courts. So I'm watching and actively investigating and researching, and I can't wait to unpack more. I mean, one thing I was going to say is that, last time I was in Bangladesh, when I arrived in the airport, they didn't know what to do with me because they had one letter from the UNIS administration saying they should let me in. And they also had another letter on the file saying that I was blacklisted because of my previous stint when I was in Bangladesh under Sheikh Hasina, when I was blacklisted. And so they had to hold me for a while in the airport because they just didn't know what to do. The special branch guys didn't know which order to follow. And so I think, for me, that's a testament to how a lot has changed at the top and in various other places, but that change is not uniform. There's not necessarily been a transformation all the way through. The fact that this special branch guy was unsure how to react or whether to kick me out again or whether to let me through. They did let me through. I think, that shows how much things are hanging in the air, right? And so I'm hoping that the way things progress, increasingly, it creates more transparency and people feel more able to come forward with information from before, because I think there are a lot of people probably who have information of serious wrongdoing under the Awami League government that are still too scared to come forward and talk about it. But they are kind of the key to, getting these stories out there and full accountability.